Bibles, we're going to go to Luke chapter 10. And just like TJ's talking about, really excited. We're kicking off, like he said, a four-week Advent series next Sunday. He and Jeff Hillier will be teaching that. And then also mark your calendars. On Christmas Eve, we're going to be right here from 3 to 4 p.m. We're going to be celebrating the birth of Jesus together. It'll be a family service. We'll have a candlelight. We're going to sing Christmas songs and just really anticipate the birth of Jesus once again. And then last but not least, we've got Selah Sunday happening the last Sunday of the year. We do this every year, and Selah just means to rest. And so every year we don't meet physically here, but we have a pre-recorded kind of service where we reflect on what God has done in 2021 and look forward to 2022 and just saying, God, what do you want to do? Praying, saying, God, what do you want to do in our lives individually, but what do you want to do corporately? So really, really excited about that. And anytime I share on a Sunday, by the way, my name's Jonathan. But anytime, you're a mess. Please don't do that. But my name's Jonathan. I serve as the executive pastor here. And anytime I'm here on a Sunday, I always say this, but I'm so thankful to be a part of this church body. I've been a part of this body for 9 years since the beginning when we were meeting in a house. And just to see this church go from meeting in a house to meeting in a hotel to the Dunham School and now here, it's just been really cool to see the faithfulness of God. I'm so thankful for so many of you here who have invested in my life personally, whether it be lunch or dinner or serving around here. I'm just so thankful for the impact that you've had on my life. And even some of you guys I might not know as well, but I see the way that you serve on our A teams. I see the way that you give financially. I even hear stories throughout the week of how you're investing in people in your workplaces, you're investing in people in your classroom, and we're seeing the gospel happen outside of these four walls, and that's really cool. And so, once again, I just want to say how grateful I am to be a part of this church. I truly believe that the best is yet to come here at Antioch Baton Rouge. I really believe that. That's my prayer, and so I'm so excited. And then last but not least, I've got my family here this morning, a bunch of people on the front row. Thanks for being here. All righty, guys, so Luke chapter 10, hopefully you had enough time to go there. We're going to be looking at verses 38 through 42. We're going to start there. Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. If you don't have it on your phone or whatever, it's going to be on the screen behind me. But it says this, it says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman by the name of Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care? Don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Would you tell her to help me? Jesus responds, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. Indeed, only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. It won't be taken away from her. This morning, I want to talk to you about having margin for what matters. So if you're taking notes, write that down, margin for what matters. I'm going to pray for us as we jump in. Jesus, we thank you for the word this morning. God, I pray that as we dive into your word, God, that you would make it come to life, Jesus. I pray for each of us in this room, maybe we're watching online, God, I pray that we would have an encounter with you this morning. I pray that every word that I speak, God, it'd be from you. God, it'd fall on hearts that are ready to receive your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, hey guys, I got a bit of a confession to make. I am what some people might call a bit of a hypocrite. Last time I was up here, I talked about having patience in suffering. That was the last message I preached. And I talked about having patience. And some of you guys who know me really well know I'm not the most patient person. Like, I like things done immediately. And this morning, as I talk about margin, I'm kind of in the same boat. I feel like a little bit of a hypocrite because a month ago, I was meeting with my counselor, Joel. And if you've never been to counseling, I think it's incredible. I think it can advance our walk with Jesus. But that's just a side note. But really, I was meeting with Joel. And it was after like a long couple of weeks. I felt overwhelmed. I felt tired. I felt worn out. And it was a Wednesday morning. And I didn't have a meeting scheduled with Joel, but I looked at like the scheduling portal, and I was like, I need to meet with him. And typically, he's booked like a month out, and I was like, I probably won't be able to see him soon. But luckily, I look online, and he's got an appointment available at 1 p.m. that day. So immediately, I schedule it, and I was like, that's going to be my lunch break. I'm going to go meet with Joel. And so meet with Joel for probably 15 or 20 minutes. I'm just telling Joel kind of everything that's happening in life, and I see him writing stuff down on his yellow pad. He's writing notes, and I'm just kind of going and going and going, saying how tired I am, and this is happening, that's happening. And whenever I get done talking, I said, Joel, do you have any advice for me? And he looks back at his yellow notepad, and he begins to read everything off. He says, well, you're engaged right now. He said, that's a really good thing, but that's a change in season. He said, you're helping lead Antioch Baton Rouge. You're working on your MBA. He said, you own like a small janitorial company. And then he listed off a couple other things that were happening that week. And he said, it's no surprise to me that you feel overwhelmed. He's like, it seems like you got a lot on your plate. In general, you're kind of managing things pretty well, but your plate is full. And that was a month ago, and I told Joel, I said, hey, you're not going to believe this, but I'm actually talking about margin to our church. And Joel just kind of started laughing. And I was like, I can't tell if he's laughing with me or at me, and just kind of like you're laughing right now, I was like, what am I doing? I need margin in my life. And whenever I read Luke chapter 10, and we hear the story about Mary and Martha, you might be familiar with it if you've grown up in church, but we see this story. I don't know if you caught this, but it says that Martha was the one who opened her home to Jesus. Martha was the one who said, Jesus, I hear you're coming to town. I'm going to open my home to you. Scholars believe that Martha was the older sister, and then you have Mary, and then you have Lazarus. And so Martha was the homeowner, and she's the one who started off with really good intentions. And she says, hey, I want to open up my home to Jesus. But we fast forward in the text, and we see that it's actually Mary who's sitting at Jesus' feet, and Martha's getting things ready. I think I personally, and maybe you do as well, relate a lot with Martha. A lot of our lives are filled with Martha moments where we start off with really good intentions. We say, hey, I want to love Jesus, I want to serve Jesus. But when we actually look at our lives, we look up and we feel overwhelmed. I feel like Martha's probably like me. Martha probably said, Jesus, you can come to my house, but probably committed to 2 or 3 other things that day. She probably looked up at her watch and said, oh, wait, Jesus is coming. I've got to get there. And she gets to her house, and my bet is it was Jesus, so he was either early or on time at the very least. And so, I mean, that's neither here nor there, but I feel like Martha got to her house, and she looks up, and she feels overwhelmed by all that has to be done. And so much so that she feels so overwhelmed that she goes up to Jesus, and she asks this question. She says, Lord, do you even care? Do you even care? And I think so often for us as Jesus followers, we can ask the same question. It might not be in those words, but we ask the question, God, I'm doing so much for you. Do you even care? I feel overwhelmed. I'm at work. I'm in school. I'm serving you. I'm leading a life group. I'm discipling people. I'm trying to invest in community. And I honestly just feel really overwhelmed. Jesus, do you even care? Have you ever been there? And once again, I think most of our lives are made up of Martha moments. It's made up of lives spent in the kitchen serving God. It's spent getting the house ready, working in our jobs, working it with our schoolwork, and we're more like Martha than like Mary. And I love what Jesus says. Jesus doesn't rebuke Martha for serving. He just says this basically to Martha. I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially says, Martha, it feels like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, and you're trying to do it all by yourself. Would you just come sit by me? Would you sit at my feet and learn from me? And I just love that. I feel like that's a promise for all of us, that all of us can feel busy at times. I mean, you think that was 2,000 years ago, and Martha was so busy. Well, you look at our lives, and we work more than ever before. We've got commitments every single weekend. There's a birthday, there's a wedding, there's this, there's that. And our schedules are completely full, and we feel overwhelmed. And even at church, we've got programs happening every day. I mean, we've got Antioch Discipleship School, we got Jesus Hour, we got life groups, we got discipleship, we got Sunday service, we got everything. And my fear, even as a pastor of this church, is, man, I don't want to look up in 100 years and say that, man, we did a really good job of teaching people how to be busy, but we failed to make disciples of Jesus. And so whenever I look at Martha's life, man, I'm just like, man, we've got to get this. We've got to simplify our lives. Because if we keep running at, this pace that Jesus didn't intend for us, we're going to run ourselves into the ground. And we're going to ask that question often, Lord, do you even care? And so this morning, I want to look at 3 areas, even as a church right now, as we look forward to 2022, we're kind of ripping up the playbook for what we've always done. And we're basically saying, we're saying, we can't do what we've always done. Let's start from scratch. And I think similarly for our individual lives, we almost need to just kind of rip up the playbook and start from scratch and make sure that the main things in our life are the main things and that they're in order. And so to do that this morning, I want to look at the life of Jesus. Jesus was the most important person on earth. He had the biggest mission on earth. He had to save the world. He did it in about 3 years, and we're still talking about him today. And so it feels like his plate was full, but he did it in a way that seems attainable at times. And so before we start looking at margin though, I think we have to realize why do our lives not have margin? And I think it's this idea of, at least for me, or for most of us, it feels like we're oftentimes discontent. It feels like we think if we just get that pay raise, or if we just have that friendship, or if we just move up this ladder at work, or if we just have this degree, we're then going to feel content. But how many of you know you can kind of look forward to that goal, and you get there, and you realize, this actually isn't fulfilling. And I love what Paul says in Philippians chapter 4. We're in that Philippians series the past 4 weeks, and Jaden and Jillian did a great job. But I want to look at Philippians 4:12 real quick. I'm just going to read it to you. It'll be on the screens. But Paul says this about contentment. He says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether it is well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want. He says, I can do all of this through him who gives me strength. And Paul's basically teaching you and I that contentment is not something that you and I are born with. We're not born into this world being content. Actually, human nature is we are discontent because of sin. And we think more and more and more will fulfill us. But whenever we look at Paul says, I've learned this contentment piece. Contentment is something that you and I are going to have to learn. And I think a lot of times we hesitate with wanting contentment in our lives because we think that contentment equates to complacency. We think, hey, I'm trying to grow my business, and if I say I'm content, that means I'll be complacent and we won't make progress and we won't make profit. But in reality, that's not what contentment means. The world's definition of contentment is happiness. But as Jesus followers, contentment really means that our souls can be satisfied. It means that our mind, our will, and our emotions can be satisfied in Christ. In Christ, that's where we find our satisfaction. And so as Paul is saying, he's saying, hey, we need to be content and we need to learn the secret to contentment. I think that's one thing that we have to start, before we start creating margin in our lives, we have to learn contentment. And as we look at the life of Jesus this morning, I think so often, as we look at those three areas, I think we know the commands of Jesus, but we don't necessarily know the person of Jesus. For example, we've got the command of go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And typically I see people do one of two things. The first thing that people do is that they run around like chickens with their heads cut off, and they just run around with go, go, go. We got to preach the gospel. People are dying and going to hell. And then the second set of people that I normally see is just people that sit on the sideline. They're just like, that feels overwhelming. The furthest west I've been to is Texas, so how am I going to preach the gospel to everyone? But here's the thing. We know the commands of Jesus, but we don't know the person of Jesus. But whenever we know the person of Jesus, that command of going into all the world seems a little more attainable. And so I want to look at, like I said, the life of Jesus, and I want to look at three big areas of our life as we kind of rip up our rhythms right now and look forward to next year and say, hey, God, would you shape me and would you mold me? I think we've got to start with these three areas. And the first area that I see Jesus in is margin for God. If you're taking notes, that's point number one. We've got to have margin for God. I love what it says in Luke chapter 5, verse 15 through 17. It says this. It says, yet the news about him, being Jesus, spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and be healed of their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. I don't know if you caught that, but the demand of Jesus' ministry is getting up to him. People are hearing about Jesus, and there's more demand than ever. And Jesus' first response was not to heal everybody immediately. His first response was to have margin for God. It says that he often withdrew. Jesus often withdrew. He often withdrew. I have a question for you just in your life. Do you have rhythms of often withdrawing with Jesus? Whether it be spending time with him or taking a weekly Sabbath, do you have that rhythm? And this message, it can feel self-helpy at times, but the whole goal of this is that you would get away with Jesus and pray about these things, you and God. I'm not here to tell you that you need an hour quiet time every day. I'm not here to do that, but I want to look at the framework of Jesus. The first thing that he did was he often withdrew. The second thing he did was he chose lonely places. He found places to disconnect from the world. He found places, he didn't have a phone at the time, but he found places to disconnect from his phone, disconnect from technology, disconnect from the demands of the world to get with God. He found sacred places in order to be quiet and alone. He found that's where he could hear from God. He often withdrew. He chose lonely places. The last thing he did was he prayed. As he got away, he was able to talk to God. It wasn't these prayers that sounded so sophisticated or anything like that. He just basically was telling God what was happening in his life and waiting to hear from God. The Bible says that Jesus didn't say anything until he heard his Father say it. He didn't do anything until he saw his Father do it. And it's the same for us. It wasn't like this magic potion, but he just found time to get away with Jesus and say, hey, God, this is what's happening in my life. And I think a lot of times the reason why we don't create margin for God and our life's not a discipline is that we oftentimes think that we are the God of our own lives. We think it's up to us to solve every issue, solve every problem. We get a phone call and we go into go mode. But what I love about Jesus in this text is that he didn't go into go mode whenever the crowds came. He withdrew. And I think so often we can think, well, if I withdraw the opportunities, whether it be work or school or people, I might lose those opportunities. But I love in the next verse it says this. It says, but Jesus often went to lonely places and prayed. And the next verse says this. It says, and the power of the Lord was present on him to heal the sick. So it wasn't until that he got away with God, and it wasn't until he had margin with God and got away with Jesus, that from that place he healed people. Could it be that we won't find the answers to the problems that we face daily until we first get away with God? Would it be said of us that first and foremost, as we're creating our schedules, that we would have margin for God? The second area I want to look at is the margin for others. And I think for most of us, this is an easy one for us. We make time for people so often. People want to get with us, and immediately we put it in our calendars. But I love the rhythm of Jesus. I want to look at this, and it'll make sense in a second. But Matthew chapter 9, verses 36 through 38 say this. It says, when he saw the crowds, he being Jesus, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. You might say, how does this relate to having margin for others? What I love about this is Jesus had this framework. You might not see it, but he had this framework of basically the masses, the 12, and the 3, talking about James, John, and Peter. He had the masses, he had the 12 disciples, and then 3. And in this text, we see that to have margin for others, we have to be really specific about who our other people are. Who our other people are. Sure, Jesus cared about everyone. He loved everyone. But in this text, what I love is that Jesus modeled for us is, it says the crowds, he saw the crowds and he had compassion on them. So there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of people Jesus is seeing. And sure, he is God and he could solve everything in an instant. But what he modeled for the disciples and what he modeled for you and I is that we are human. We have limitations, and he operated in that humanity. He didn't heal everybody in a second. He didn't try to go fix all their problems. He didn't even tell his disciples to let's go fix all their problems. He said, first and foremost, for the masses, what we need to do is pray. He didn't try to get in everybody's situation and try to fix it. He said, first and foremost, for the masses, I'm going to pray. And then we see this idea where he had these 12, the 12 disciples. These were the people that he was called to invest in. And I think so often we think, well, I don't want to be exclusive. I don't want to be exclusive because I love people. But to follow Jesus modeled this for us. We can love people, but chances are we're going to disappoint others. We're going to disappoint people, but disappointment is not a sin. If anything, disappointment is creating healthy boundaries for people to meet with God themselves. Jesus said this. He said we disappoint people. Well, we disappoint people because we're limited. We have to accept the ideas of limitations in order to accept the idea that we will disappoint people. These understandings about Jesus' way will help us trust that it's right, not only right, but it's healthy and holy. It's healthy and holy to put boundaries for people. I love this. Whenever I think about the 12 that Jesus invested in, he invested in 12 people, and they were typically younger than him. I think a question that I would ask this week if I was you is, man, who are you calling me to invest in? It might be my family, it might be my coworkers, it might be people in this church, but who are you calling me to invest in? But one specific thing that I really love about this is Jesus typically invested in younger people. He took time to invest in those younger than him and impart into them. And then he had the 3. And I think a lot of times as Jesus followers, we like to think, well, once again, we can't be exclusive. And so I can't have close friends. But even Jesus had Peter, James, and John. A lot of people, scholars believe two different things. The first idea is that he was investing in them more because they'd be the heads of the church, which that's one obvious thought. The second thought was he was just relationally closer to those three people. And so I think even whenever it comes to you walking with Jesus, I think you've got to get really clear in who are your other people. You can't make time for everybody and expect not to burn out. I think typically we land in one of two camps. The first camp is we say, hey, I'm going to say yes to everyone. I'm going to invest in everyone. And then we wear ourselves down. And even I've done that myself. I've invested in everyone. And what I find is it's not really that effective. We're so broad and we're so thin and we wear ourselves out. And it's really not the most effective. But then I see people in another camp that they only invest in basically themselves and maybe their family, and that's it. And so what I see from this text is Jesus is basically saying, hey, don't go to either extreme. Don't feel like you have to invest in every single person you come across. But don't feel like you're not going to invest in everyone. Let's find this ground of who are your 12 and who are your 3. And once again, this is a framework. This is not Jesus saying you have to invest in 12 people. I know some introverts in the room are probably like, that's a lot of people. I don't have that kind of margin. But really, it's really getting with God and saying, God, who are you calling me to invest in? I think that's a prayer that we should be praying this week. So the first area is margin for God. The second one is margin for others. The third one is margin for our money. We hear this a lot in church, but Jesus preached more about money than he did anything else. And I think, I could probably preach a whole message on how we can handle our finances. But I want to look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. This is what Jesus taught. He said this. He says, Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He says this in verse 24. He says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And I think whenever it comes to us building our lives, we first have to have margin for God, margin for others. But when it comes down to our money, we live in a generation where we spend. And once again, I think it gets back to that contentment piece. We think, if I just spend more, if I just buy more experiences, buy more things, I'll be happy. But we've learned already that contentment only comes from Christ. And what we see from this text in Matthew chapter 6 is that Jesus is giving this framework when it comes to money. He's given this framework of be simple, be really straightforward. And secondly, invest in eternal things. Invest in eternal things. I think so often whenever we spend, at least even I'm guilty of this, I spend money on myself. And those things, like Jesus said, won't last. Jesus invited us to invest in things that will last. And the story that I think about whenever it comes to just people who do a really good job in our church of giving margin for their money, there are two couples in our church. And about 2 years ago, I was sharing about how I wanted to get my MBA one day. And we were at dinner, and they kind of heard, and they said, so what's stopping you? And I said, well, if I could just kind of save it for the next year and a half, that'll kind of be the solution. I'll pay for school. And less than a week later, I'm with that same couple and with one of them, and she says, hey, Jonathan, we had dinner with another couple last night, and we were telling them about how you want to get your MBA. And we just prayed and felt like God was saying that we want to help pay for 50% of your college tuition. And man, I was in tears. I was like, what do you mean? They're like, we're going to invest in 50%, you invest in the other 50. And I was just so thankful. So thankful for the MBA, sure, but even that life lesson of having margin for my money, I learned something there that those people could have easily had a nice vacation. They could have went to Europe. They could have had a great time with the money that they invested in me. But I think they learned something from Jesus, is that we're going to invest in other people. We're going to invest in things that are eternal. We're not just going to splurge on ourselves. I think practically for myself, Marley and I are getting married in June, and we're really excited about that. We're looking at, trying to buy a house. And it's so easy whenever we're looking at houses to want to buy the nicest one. You start looking and you're like, oh, I would love to have that, and that would be cool, and this would be cool. But when you look at the life of Jesus, it's not about us getting as much as we can ourselves. It's not about building up our empires. It's about investing in things that last. I think this week, as we begin to pray about our money, I think a great prayer point is, God, where can I invest that is somewhere that's lasting? Maybe it's the church. Maybe it's individuals. Maybe it's people in your life group. I don't know what it is, but we've got to create margin to invest in other people. And there's a lot of great other, money management principles that I could get into today. But that's really the framework that I see. I really do see that Jesus is just like, hey, invest your money and live a simple life. Don't go, super above your means. And invest in eternity. And you might say, well, how much is too much money for me to have in the bank? And once again, I think this is a framework. It's for you to pray with God. We see Solomon, the richest man on earth, was loved by God, had favor from God, so he was really rich. And then we see the widow who gave all that she had, and she was loved by God too. So I don't think it's the amount in our bank accounts, but I do think it's us hearing God and saying, God, what are you saying for my life, and how can I get involved with that? And so just kind of once again, I want to just kind of sum up these 3 points again. For us, as we are building the framework for our lives, I think a lot of times we feel overwhelmed because we've got so much happening. But once again, if we start with making margin for God, if we say, I'm going to have a daily discipline to find time to get away with Jesus by myself, I'm going to be in a good spot. If I find time to have margin for other people and really know who those people are, like be really clear with, hey, these are the people that God is calling me to invest in, and my yes is going to be yes and my no is going to be no, I think we'll be in a better spot. And last but not least, I think if we create margin for our money, oh man, guys, we're not going to feel overwhelmed. We're not going to feel like we have to work ourselves to death, but we can really create space for God to move. We can invest in other people. And one thing I love about this story we see, once again, in the first story that we read of Mary and Martha, we see Martha saying, Lord, do you even care? And I think it's so easy for us. We get, once again, like Martha, we get overwhelmed. And we're like, God, do you even care? And Jesus is kind of called to us. It's like, just come back and sit at my feet. It's a lot more simple than you think. It's a lot more easy than you think. And one thing that's been really cool for us, and I know it sounds really simple when you're like, I work in the real world, Jonathan. I'm not a pastor. We don't pray about everything. I have to make decisions on the fly. But even for us as pastors, as we help, kind of run this church, so often for us, it's easy for us not to pray. We kind of get in the room and we have some good ideas and some good strategies, and we're like, this seems good to us. But it's been really cool in the past couple months. Not even intentionally. Like I was preaching this and I knew I was preaching this, but our oversight leadership team, Gabe and Jose and Eva, we meet together, have an extended meeting, I think every, once a month for 2 hours. And it's the whole idea is that we would hit big things in that meeting, big things, big decisions for our church. It was really cool. In the last 2 meetings that we had, we didn't talk about this. We had a big agenda. And I walked into that meeting feeling overwhelmed. And we said, hey, let's spend a little time praying. And what it turned into was us for an hour sitting on the ground. We didn't plan to sit. We talked about it after. We're like, man, we're all sitting. And I think it was symbolic of just like Jesus is saying, like, put the first thing first. He was like, Martha, Martha, you're concerned, you're worked up about so many things, but just come sit at my feet. Could it be said the same for you? Is Jesus calling your name saying, could he be calling you and saying, come sit at my feet. Come sit at my feet. You're missing the whole idea. It was a 2-hour meeting, like I said. In the first hour, we spent just kind of praying, hearing God. And if I'm honest with you, some of the, throughout that hour, at times I was really spiritual and I was really hearing God. And other times I was like looking at the clock. I was like, oh gosh, we've got like 20 things to hit. We've got an hour left. Are we going to make it? But what was really cool was we just heard from God. And then whenever we met for that hour, it felt like God had already answered some questions that we had. And even the other things were like easier and lighter to talk about because we first invited God. I think as we go into 2022, I really want to encourage you guys. We need to make time for God. We need to make time for other people. We need to make time for our money because whenever we're clear about the main things, we can serve Jesus, and it's this serving that lasts. It's not this serving where we burn out tomorrow, but it's this serving that can go the long haul, whenever we can be in our 80s and 90s saying, I still love Christ. Because I got the main things right. I got the 3 things really clear. I was crystal clear about those. And so the other things I was able to say yes and no to, but I was clear about those things. And so as we go into ministry time this morning, I want to do it a little differently. Typically we stand up and we pray together. And I think that's great for most weeks. But as I was praying for this message, I really just felt like God was calling us to do two things. The first is he wants us to practice sitting at his feet. I know it might seem awkward. We're in a room full of a bunch of people. But I want to spend a little time with us just sitting and hearing from God. If we can't do it in this room, it's going to be, quite a miracle if we can do it in our homes or out in the world, if we can't first sit in church and just hear God. And then from there, after that, we're going to have some questions up on the screen. I want us as a community to come together and just discuss, hey, what's one thing that I learned from this message? Who can help hold me accountable to that? And then we're just going to ask, hey, how can I pray for you? We're going to break up in groups of 2, 3. If you came by yourself, hey, find somebody around you. But the first thing I want us to do is just hear from God. We're going to put, I think, 2 minutes on the clock. I've got the time behind me. But we're going to have some keys in the background. Just invite everyone just to close your eyes, sit where you're at, and just say, God, what would you want to speak to me today? Just ask that question. We're going to spend 2 minutes just hearing from God.